Welcome to the Pot Live Podcast. I'm your host, Lenny G, and I can't believe it. We've already broken through 100 episodes. We want to thank you, the listeners, thousands of you that have sent beautiful comments, beautiful notes to us. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoy it. This next year, we're going to bring you the thought leaders, entertainers, trailblazers, CEOs of all the cannabis companies you want to hear from. People that are inventing new products, people that are bringing this cannabis industry to the mainstream. We are going to offer you education, value, and entertainment. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. And we are back on the Pot Live Podcast. I'm your host, Lenny G, and today we have quite the interesting guest, a lifelong cannabis enthusiast, Mr. Ed Rosenthal. He is a California horticulturist, author, publisher, and a cannabis grower known for his advocacy for the legalization of marijuana use, former columnist for High Times Magazine, has a new book out, has several books in his past that he's done. Ed, welcome to the show.
I'm happy to be with you.
Awesome. So Ed, those of our listeners and our listenership is all over the map, from young to old, beginner, expert, business owner, recreational user, everything. So we can hit a whole bunch of different demos here. Tell everybody a little bit about your background. Where did you come from, and how did you get into cannabis as an interest and as a business?
Well, first of all, my background was in terms of interest as a child, and then continuing. I was always interested in plants, horticulture, and botanical sciences. And so I spent a lot of my youth either growing plants, reading about them, studying them. And from that, I had sort of a non-academic background in that I had studied it, but not necessarily taken classes. And then I met cannabis, and as soon as I met it, I realized that cannabis and I were going to be allies, and we were going to have a long-term relationship. And that I was correct in that. And then I decided to start growing it, and I had already had some background in horticulture, and I was growing it in my apartment in the Bronx. And then I moved out to California and continued to grow it and to study the growing of it. Then at one point I started building these, what I call them, indoor greenhouses, and they were sort of like the tents that are available now, and installing them in New York. And then from that, I met my co-author, Mel Frank, and he had been growing in Manhattan in his apartment. And we decided to write a book about it. And we wrote this book, Indoor Outdoor Marijuana Growers Guide, and it sold like wildfire. And then, if you're successful at something, you tend to continue doing it. So then we wrote another book together, and both of us have continued to write independently.
So grew up in the Bronx, like you said. I hope you're a Yankee fan, Ed. Is that true?
Well, first I was a Giants fan, but they moved to San Francisco. So yes.
All right. I'm a Yankee fan, so that's why I throw it in there. But all right, so you move out to California, and give us a relationship of when you started growing out there. I know everything, wasn't really legal till a certain year. How had the experience changed when you first went out there versus over the last, decade or so, where cannabis has become more mainstream?
Well, actually, California has a little different history than most other states. California, the first change from total prohibition came in 1974, when Governor Jerry Brown signed a law so that possession of under an ounce for personal use became a ticketable offense rather than a criminal offense. So the police could write a ticket for it. And then there was a court decision that said, well, if you were growing for personal use, that would still come under that. So that people who were growing small amounts had protection against going to prison. That was based on a case called Williamson. And I started doing some expert testimony in these what were called Williamson cases. And the question for the judge would be whether this person was growing for personal use or for sale. For sale would still be a felony. Growing for personal use would be ticketable offense. And this fellow, Bill Logan, and I started, the attorney, he's from Three Rivers, California. We started doing a number of these cases. And there was this narcotics officer who was a head narcotics officer in California. He was a terrible liar. He would just make stuff up as he went along in order to get a conviction. And Bill and I started going after this guy, this fellow, and any attorneys who were going to be facing him to get in touch with us. And we finally got to a court case where the judge said that he wouldn't disqualify this fellow, but what he would do is he would take a nuanced view of his testimony. And he said to me, going out of the courtroom, the narcotics officer said to me, "Got past you this time." And I looked at him and I said, "It's the last time, Charlie. It's the last time. We're going to get you." A week later, he retired. And basically, when that happened, it changed the tenor of policing cannabis in California somewhat.
What year was this about, Ed?
This was in the late 90s.
Okay.
But I wanted to talk about it. So in 1974, that was, so people did not have the full brunt of prohibition. And then in 96, Dennis Perone, who was a great activist, proposed Proposition 215, which said medical cannabis should be legal. And we were able to, working with national organizations, we were able to get it on the ballot. And we really didn't have to campaign for it because it was so popular. And once it was on the ballot, then it won that year. So
Was that the first state to go medically legal?
I think Oregon might have been before that, but Oregon didn't have the impact of California. Now, I want you to think about this. So the first law was in 1974. And let's say that kids they're not that aware of, or they weren't that aware of cannabis until they were 15 or 16. So let's say it was 15 years. So if you subtract 15 years from 1974, it means they were born in 1959. So anyone who was born after 1959 did not have the full brunt of prohibition in California. Then in 96, when the medical passed, and the medical, there were doctors who were writing recommendations, and I have migraine headaches. I got one for mocking and disruptive behavior. And the doctor who wrote that, Dr. Mike Alcalay, he didn't say whether that would exacerbate it or moderate that behavior. But I did get the recommendation for it. And also, it was very easy to get a recommendation, $50, and any complaint, medical complaint, you got a recommendation. So there were a whole group of people who were walking around or who are in California who could legally possess a larger amount than an ounce, but a larger amount of marijuana, and could grow it legally.
Now, if I can interrupt you. So at that time, when you got your medical card or approval, if you will, dispensaries weren't like they are now all over the place. How did you actually legally acquire it besides growing it yourself? Or was it that you could only grow it yourself?
Well, actually, the same fellow who started the initiative, Dennis Perone, that he had opened up a dispensary right in the margin, right in a commercial district in the margin of the gay area, one of the gay areas in San Francisco. And it served two functions. This was before there were any drugs for AIDS. The only drugs that they would give people is for pain, because There were just no drugs out there. And the only thing, one of the other drugs that would help people was cannabis. And so it was very important that he opened up this dispensary. And the city, it was fine with the city, but the state attorney general closed it down. Now, it had been open for a couple of years. So there were all these people who had gotten training at the dispensary about how to run a dispensary, the bud tenders and all kinds of other people associated with it, packagers. So when Dennis's club was closed down by the attorney general, by the state attorney general, all these other clubs or dispensaries started opening up by people who had been trained at that dispensary. It was like a hydra. When they cut the head off, many new heads grew. And so that was the start of dispensaries worldwide, right wow. There.
I never heard that story. That's interesting.
So if you go back to that time, 1996, now let's do the 15 years. So that would be 81. So anyone who was born after 81 always experienced that medical patients, and it was very easy to become a medical patient, as I mentioned, were able to carry, grow, buy, sell marijuana. So that, if you think about that, 81 to now is about 41 years old. So anyone who was born after 81 experienced people legally growing and selling, using marijuana. So that's the trajectory that California had before legalization. Virtually the entire population, if you lived here, virtually experienced some relaxation of prohibition before they came of age of using it. So this is a different model than many other states. For instance, Oklahoma had terrible laws. They'd sentence people for 20, 30 years for cannabis. It was considered, a terrible moral and ethical crime that was worth putting these people in prison. I was an expert witness in a case of Will Foster, who received a sentence of 93 years by a jury. And later, after 4.5 years, they said, if you'll find somebody who will take care of you during probation, we'll let you out of prison. And Will called me and I said, yeah, come on down. I'll be your probation guardian. I'm a really good probation guardian. I understand the problems that he would have, especially in acquiring cannabis. So here he was on probation for cannabis, but he was legally allowed to use it because he was a medical patient. So now he moved back to his home state, Oklahoma, where he's growing, and the two cops who busted him are in prison for bribery. So
justice being served. Wow.
Yeah, I suggested that he go visit them and put $10 on their
All right. So now you're a big advocate during this time, obviously, for the whole industry. You're visible with expert testimony and everything. Then all of a sudden we hit the early 2000s. Did that make you a target of the feds? And I know that federal law doesn't recognize state laws a lot of times. So tell us what happened there.
Well, yeah. Well, so let's see. In the city that I was living in, it was very favorable towards helping patients and towards these dispensaries and such. And they had a program where they, in order to be legal under federal and state laws, what they would do is they would deputize certain people to supply cannabis to patients. And I had no experience in determining who was a patient and who wasn't a patient. So what I did is I supplied clones to the dispensaries so they could decide who the patients were. I was more of the manufacturers. I was making clones and delivering them to patients. So then in 2002, and I was told by the city attorney and the state attorney general agreed with this, that as long as I stayed within the regulations, that I was free from prosecution by city, state, or federal. Well, the feds disagreed with that, and they said that the state authorities had no right to determine what was legal federally. And the judge in this case, the Supreme Court Justice Breyer, his brother, who was my trial judge, and he was an apparatchik of the state. He did whatever the state attorney wanted. He always accommodated the state attorney. He discounted throughout his career. He discounted defense lawyers. He was very sarcastic, and he one time said, "Justice, whatever that means." I mean, that was this kind of guy. He would have been a good guy if he, in a Nazi regime, what do you want me to do? Oh, I could do that. I could do that. You know, and he loved wearing his robe of honor. It was disgraceful. And as he crawled into the court, as Phillips would say, he was just a federal thug. So anyway, he did not allow the jury to hear that I had been appointed by the city and the state to supply the cannabis to patients. He didn't let them know that it was a medical case, and the jury didn't know about any of this until after they rendered a verdict of guilty. And then they found out what the case was all about, that I had been appointed by the city, that I was helping patients, and they wound up they said that they felt that they were stained, that they were dirty, that the judge had lied to them, that, they did not have good words for the judge. So I was convicted, and then there was a weekend, and I was supposed to come back the following week to determine whether, before I was sentenced, whether I would be placed in prison or whether I would continue to be out on bail. So they decided that to keep me out on bail. But what happened was that the judge walked into the courtroom, and as he turned, he looked to the right, and he looked to the left as he was coming in, actually, and he saw 8 of the 12 jurors in the courtroom, no longer as jurors, but as civilians, right on in the front seats, the closest seats you could do. And he turned white, and he sank down in his seat. And the judge, Charles Breyer, he and his wife, Cindy, she's passed away. They were socialites. And, you'd see their names in the papers at different parties and events and things. And he belonged to this men's club, and there were reports that he was being isolated from this trial. When I had been arrested, the district attorney, Hallinan, I should say, the head of the DEA came out to announce my arrest. And this was at 6 a.m. on 7 a.m. on a talk show. And by that time, people were already aware that I had been arrested, and he got a very poor reception on the show. Then he went to the Commonwealth Club, which is this discussion group, and the federal government probably thought it was conservative people who would applaud that the drug market was being cleaned up. So when he got there, the district attorney, Hallinan, was outside. Now, I was in jail, but I've heard that this attorney, Hallinan, was out there with a bullhorn excoriating this fellow. And in the Commonwealth Club, he was being booed, and people were yelling liar at him, and they couldn't get one person to have a question that was positive to him. So that was the mood in San Francisco. And so Cindy and he were socialites, and they realized if I went to jail, their social life would be over. They would just be excised out of San Francisco society. So he wound up giving me 1 day time served. So I walked out. I had done my time because I had been in prison, in jail during the arrest. I had only gotten a day. And all these groups had, there was a big press conference right outside, and all these people were saying, "Oh, the judge is so good, he had the foresight to do this, and he was,
So
just a great guy,
he
right?"
spun it to make him look better, so his
Yeah,
social
yeah,
circle
yeah,
wouldn't
right.
disappear.
Well, it didn't quite work out that way. And I was the last speaker. And I said very vociferously, "This judge did me no favors. He made me into a felon. No one should go to prison for marijuana. This is not over." And all that sweet talk and the kumbaya dancing ring, all of that, that's not literal, but that kumbaya moment, that evaporated into reality, that this was a war that was still going on. So, then I appealed I didn't appeal the sentence, but I appealed the conviction, and because one of the jurors had been intimidated by the judge
Now, what was
and
the
by
conviction
another
for? The
lawyer.
conviction for was what? Distributing or
It was manufacturing, maintaining a place that's manufacturing, and conspiracy.
even though the
So,
local jurisdictions gave you approval to do all that?
right. So I had a second trial. And the interesting thing about this trial, oh, by the way, when those jurors came back, we looked to try to find another time when a majority of the jurors rejected their conviction. We couldn't find that in American history. I mean, it might have happened, but we didn't find that. Then, because the feds decided to try me again. Now, the interesting thing about this trial was this. I had already done my time. I did that 1 day.
Yep.
So, and I had paid a fine. So if I was found guilty, they couldn't resentence me and they couldn't fine me. So if I was found guilty, I would just walk out. There was no more to be done. There was no probation, no nothing, right?
So
And
what
I
was
was
their
found.
win? Their end game was what? Ego, just to confirm your conviction?
Yeah, yeah. And they did. I was found guilty because the jury still couldn't hear the things. And just think how dumb these jurors had to be to not know anything about my case. What kind of people, just think, these are people who unqualified as citizens to make a determination if they hadn't heard it. I mean, what I'm saying is they have to be unaware of their surroundings to say, "Oh, I don't know anything about this case."
Right.
Because it was in the papers. It wasn't. Oh, here's another thing. Two other things that this case did was the New York Times carried my case, and they had a front page article about my situation. And part of the reason they did probably was because I was a publisher. My book had been reviewed by the New York Times. So, it was sort of like they already had an experience with me of some sort. And so they carried a front page headline, and then they did 2 editorials about the case saying basically that the case should be dropped and I shouldn't be sentenced. So that was kind of unusual. I mean, like usually when people are arrested, nobody wants to be around them, and their status goes down, and I was arrested, and that made me more respectable. Anyway, at one point in the trial, a newspaper reporter went over to my daughter, who was 11 years old at the time, and they asked her, "Well, what do you think of this?" And she says, "My dad helps sick people. My dad's a hero."
That's great.
And the tabloid paper in San Francisco carried a picture of the 2 of us hugging, and her saying, "My dad's a hero." It's like, who gets a headline like that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway, that went national. And
Great.
what her 4 words, "My dad's a hero," did, they had this whole campaign that medical marijuana would send an inappropriate message for children, that marijuana could be a medicine. So
Right.
that's why people shouldn't be able to use marijuana medically, because it might give kids the right idea about it. So they had this $20 million campaign that they had with Parents for Drug Free America, or one of those organizations. And it was that whole thing that marijuana is inappropriate. So that ended their $20 million campaign. 4 words, "My dad's a hero." Boom. That was the end of it.
That's beautiful.
So, but that did stop me from actually pursuing marijuana, cultivation of marijuana for a number of years, because I felt they were still out to get me.
Sure, I bet that must
So,
have been that must have been
but,
very tough to
but,
go through.
well, I was still writing and I was doing consulting, and, you get past things, right? That was an unusual time, from going from being an expert witness in marijuana cases to being the defendant.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, that's such a unique and interesting story, but I'm glad you came out the other end well. So now tell us, let's move on to the positive. So you wrote several books. I know your latest book is the Cannabis Growers Handbook, right? I believe that's the right title that you sent me a
Yes.
copy of. So thank you so much. We actually have to give a shout out. We have a mutual friend. We'll call him Ray Daggs, who connected us, and appreciate him connecting us so I can get to meet you and get a copy of your book. So tell everybody about the book and maybe where they can actually get it and what the book entails.
Well, first of all, the book's available everywhere. You can get it, at Amazon. You could look up my name, edrosenthal.com, and you can get it. So, and it's available in many, many bookstores. And you just put the title of the book in, and you'll get any number of offers to sell it. But the book is the latest of its. My first book was Indoor Outdoor Marijuana Growers Guide. And then with Mel Frank, we did a second book together called Marijuana Growers Guide. And that was a book that changed marijuana growing in the 70s. It came out in 79 and 77, 79. And it was basically, it went from becoming a mystical method of growing marijuana to being more horticultural. And I won't go through each of the different iterations of the book, but the new book, I wrote it with a fellow by the name of Rob Flannery, who has a doctorate in plant science from UC Davis and runs the company Dr. Rob's Farms, which is marijuana provider. And we had as collaborators in the book any number of professors and researchers and people who have been involved in the industry. And the book assumes that you know nothing about plants when you start. And it avoids the jargon, but goes pretty detailed into how to grow. There are many different levels that you can approach this book on. There are these really detailed chapters that you can just avoid, and still we go step by step in how to set up the garden and choosing which kind of garden you would like, and whether it's indoor or outdoor, and how to run it, how to grow the plants. And what we try to do is to make this totally accurate, unlike many other books, and not just based on experience, but based on one foot in the door of experience and the other foot in the hallway of science. You need some experience to understand what the science is about. And so what we try to do is to bring all of that material into this book in a way that everybody could understand it. So I would recommend it both for people who are already cultivating, even if you've had a lot of experience and have been cultivating commercially for years. because it has new results of experiments that we've done. It goes very deeply into the science of it. And on the other hand, if you're just starting out, what this book is accurate and shows you easy ways to start your garden, how to set it up, how to maintain it, how to harvest, how to dry and cure. And of course, the next step, using it, people already know that.
Well, hey, listeners, you just heard it right there. Whether you're a beginner, whether you're intermediate, expert, this has all the latest and greatest ways to get yourself involved with growing your own supply, especially coming from a man with all of these years of experience. Ed, before I let you go, I always ask our guests, hit us with one thing that concerns you about the overall cannabis industry in the country now, and one thing that excites you going forward.
Well, I'm not going to give you exactly those parameters, but I think it's very important. And what's exciting to me is that when people are allowed to grow their own, and I think it's very important, no matter what the laws in the commercial area are, it's very important that people have the right to grow their own, whether it's tomatoes or cannabis, people should be able to grow it. And so that's of both concern to me. And for instance, in the state of Washington, one of the first states to have an initiative, people called me all kinds of names for opposing that initiative. But that initiative did not allow people to grow, and still does not allow people in the state of Washington to grow their own. Terrible. And then we have Fractionalized California, and that is, it's county by county. So if the county has voted, if the municipality or the county has voted, not the people, but the government has voted not to have, allow cultivation or sale of cannabis, they can do that in the county. So you can go to one county where it's allowed and then go into another county and it isn't. And it's just, stepping over a line. And for instance, in southeastern California, where Lompoc is, most of the counties around there don't allow cannabis cultivation or sales, but Lompoc does. So now there are at least a dozen dispensaries or shops in the small city, because people are coming from all of these counties where it's not legal to purchase or to sell, and going to and then bringing it back. It's stupid. It's fractionalized. All Californians should have the same law. It should not be a county by county thing. And then there are other states like New York State, for instance, which totally allows cannabis cultivation. And so does Oregon allow cannabis cultivation, and it's not county by county. And I think that's a way to go.
Yep, I think a lot of people don't realize they think California is fully legal, and there are a lot of dry areas, like you said.
It's legal to use it, but not to grow it outdoors. So you could grow it indoors, but not out. Just stupid laws. And even if you had acreage where nobody could see it except if they had a drone or something, no, you can't grow it. Then the other thing that I'm really concerned about is using police over a civil matter. I don't think that the police should be involved in the regulation of cannabis in any way. It's no longer illegal, so it should be handled civilly. And even if there's a violation of the law, it should be handled civilly, not as a criminal matter. And I think that, cops say, oh, no, but, they still want to bust you. Like, the thing about cannabis, the reason why cops want to bust you for cannabis is, like, when they see somebody who's addicted to something like, to any of the opiates, they feel contempt for them. When they see alcoholics, like so many cops are alcoholic and have these alcohol binge parties, they can understand it. But they just hate cannabis because it doesn't make people dysfunctional. And the people seem to be having happier lives. So they want to bust them. It's just a natural trait of theirs. And they they feel aggrieved that they no longer, that it's much harder to make a bust for marijuana. They feel aggrieved by it. When they say they're relieved, no, it's not really true. They want to bust as many people as possible. That's it. There are people who, to a great extent, I think that the police force and the police forces are composed of people who had PTSD before they came into the force, and they should not be handling weapons and have authority over other people. We have to get a different police force. And in doing it, first thing is to make as many things as civil and take it out of the hands of the police. And that's what people meant by defunding the police. So if you handle things civilly, then you don't need the police to handle them.
I think a lot of this divisiveness also comes from like what you just discussed in California with every municipality is different. Well, it's the same without being federally legal. There are so many, every state law is different. There's no interstate commerce allowed for these companies to succeed. There's different rules in every state, every municipality within the state, like you said. It just creates so much confusion that I don't think law enforcement nor the people know what they're allowed to do or what they're supposed to do. And it just creates so much divisiveness and confusion. It's crazy.
And I think that, the whole thing where the government is trying to take control of CBD and tax CBD, that whole thing, the CBD is used as a medicine. So they want to tax the medicine,
Yep.
Right?
Just like everything else, Ed.
Not only do they want to put the sales taxes on it, okay, maybe, but they want to put special taxes on it. So if you're using CBD for your health, you're not using it to get high because it doesn't get you high. So if you're using CBD for your health, they still want to tax you because they have this prejudice against cannabis because when people use it, they do not become dysfunctional. It might relax them. They might not be using it while they're working. I'm not suggesting that they should. But what I mean by dysfunctional, they maintain their families, they work, they're going to school, they're good citizens. Why mess with them? But the government still, it's very hard for the federal government and even the state governments to let it go.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Ed, I tell you what, thank you so much for sharing your journey with us and all of your thoughts. It was super interesting for myself and our listeners. Really appreciate you being a guest on the show, and we'll have everything about your book in the show notes, and hopefully our listeners will gravitate towards it. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
And we will see everyone next time on the Pot Live podcast.